Hello everyone. Today I am bringing you 9 of the most disturbing true Appalachian cave horror stories ever documented. In this episode, we will descend into the suffocating darkness of America's oldest mountains, where ancient limestone corridors hide secrets that were never meant to surface. From experienced spelunkers who heard voices that should not exist, to search and rescue teams who discovered evidence of crimes hidden for decades. These are the accounts that remind us why some places in Appalachia remain forbidden. Each story you are about to hear has been meticulously researched and reconstructed from witness testimonies, incident reports, and first-hand accounts of those who ventured beneath the surface and returned forever changed. To protect the identities of survivors and their families, certain names and specific locations have been modified, but the core of what happened in these caves remains undeniably real. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe for daily true horror content that will keep you questioning what lurks in the places we are told never to go. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls, because some stories demand to be told, even when those who lived them wish they could forget. Victoria had never been afraid of the dark until the mountains taught her that darkness could have a voice. She grew up in eastern Kentucky, where caves were as common as church steeples, and by the time she was 26, she had squeezed through enough narrow passages and belly crawls to think she understood what the underground had to offer. Cold air, slick limestone, the hiss of unseen water in the black. Nothing supernatural. Nothing that could not be explained with geology and time. That certainty was the only reason she agreed to follow a small group of local explorers into a system everyone in town called Chapel Hollow. Chapel Hollow was not marked on any official map. On the surface, it was just a moss-choked sinkhole on the edge of old coal land, ringed by tulip poplars and sagging fence posts. What made it different was the story that went with it. Old-timers said there used to be a revival church somewhere on that ridge before the road shifted, and the congregation moved closer to town. According to them, one spring a section of the hill gave way during a storm, and half the church slid into the earth, taking the baptismal pool and part of the choir loft with it. Over the years, the story twisted. Some said the pastor had been preaching about judgment when the ground opened. Others swore a whole choir disappeared with the collapsing floor. Nobody could agree on the details, but everyone repeated the same warning. Do not follow singing if you hear it near Chapel Hollow. Victoria heard those stories as a kid and rolled her eyes. She trusted topo maps and survey notes, not front porch gossip. When a caving buddy sent her a message about a newly discovered entrance that might connect to an unmapped system beneath the old church site, curiosity drowned out common sense. The idea of being the first to document part of that rumored network tugged at something competitive in her. She packed her gear, triple-checked her headlamp, backup lights, spare batteries, and helmet, and met the others at the trailhead just before sunset. The group was small by design. There was the organizer, a quiet man in his 30s named Mark, who had been pushing leads in the region for years. There was another regular, a wiry woman called Jen, who specialized in rigging vertical drops. A younger guy named Cole showed up with a brand new helmet and an eagerness that worried Victoria more than the cave did. She had seen enough overconfident beginners make bad decisions underground. They traded names, checked each other's gear, and then followed Mark along a faint deer trail that climbed toward the ridge. The sinkhole yawned out of the hillside like a mouth too tired to fully open. Ferns clung to its edges, and a thin ribbon of water dripped from somewhere unseen, tapping a slow, hollow rhythm against broken rock. Mark pointed to a low break in the wall, barely taller than a person's chest, where dark air pooled like smoke. That was the entrance. They clipped on their lights, did a final safety check, and one by one slid past damp stone into the earth. The temperature dropped almost immediately, trading the humid summer air for a chill that seeped through Victoria's knee pads and gloves. The passage dipped gently at first, just a sloping tunnel where their footfalls echoed in neat, controlled beats. The beam from her lamp picked out scalloped limestone, mineral curtains, pale blind cave crickets crouched in cracks. She felt that familiar shift inside, the one that came every time she left the surface. Up there, the world was loud and cluttered. Down here, it was simple: light, stone, breath. They moved in single file, Mark at the front, then Victoria, then Cole, with Jen taking up the rear. After 10 minutes, the passage narrowed into a hands and knees crawl, the kind that forced conversation to die and attention to focus on every placement. Victoria watched the dust puff around her gloves and thought about how long it had taken to settle since the last flood. How many centuries of water had carved the ceiling just high enough for them to pass. After another tight squeeze, the tunnel opened abruptly into a small chamber, just big enough for them to stand fully. The floor sloped toward a dark pool that swallowed their light without a ripple. "That is the flooded section I told you about," Mark said, his voice low but steady. "No one has pushed it yet. We'll skirt along the edge and see if we can find higher ground beyond." The air here smelled different. Not just the mineral tang she expected, but something faintly organic, like old paper kept in a damp basement. Victoria edged closer to the pool, careful to keep her boots on solid rock. The surface was perfectly still, mirror smooth. It bothered her that she could not see the far wall. Her light simply faded into a gray that felt thicker than water should be. She was about to step back when she heard it. At first, she thought it was the ring in her ears from the crawl, that high ghost tone that sometimes followed hard breathing. Then it separated into layers, into distinct notes that rose and fell together. It was not the random drip chorus she knew from other caves. It was melody. She froze, every instinct protesting at once. The sound was faint, like something drifting through several walls, but there was no mistaking the pattern. Voices. Not one, but many, weaving around each other on a tune she almost recognized from old hymnals her grandmother used to keep on the coffee table. The others stilled around her, and for a few breaths none of them said anything. The song did not stop. It just kept moving, simple and sure, from somewhere beyond that black pool. Cole whispered first. He asked if there was another entrance nearby, maybe another team in the system. Mark shook his head slowly, lamp beam sliding across slick rock. The nearest known entrance was miles away, and this section did not show up on any survey. Jen muttered, "That sound did strange things underground. It could be runoff moving over rock, wind through side passages." Her explanation was reasonable, but even she sounded like she was trying to convince herself. The melody shifted, rising half a step, as if an invisible congregation had just stood up together. The hair on Victoria's arms prickled under her thermal layer. She did not like that the song did not seem to care that they were there. No pause, no stumble, just a smooth continuation in a language of vowels and long-held notes. She found herself counting the voices without meaning to. 5, maybe 6 distinct lines, all adult, no children. They were too precise for echoes of their own voices. They had not spoken enough to leave that kind of trail. "Let us record it," Victoria said finally, forcing her voice to stay even. "If it is just water or wind, it will show up on the audio. If it is not, we will have something to review on the surface." Mark nodded and pulled a small digital recorder from a dry pouch on his harness. He set it on a flat rock near the edge of the pool, the tiny red light blinking as it captured the sound. For the next minute, they stood there in silence, headlamps dimmed to their lowest setting to save batteries, while the unseen choir sang on. The song never faltered. It wound through a verse, then what felt like a chorus, then back again, like a loop practiced for decades. Victoria's breath fogged in front of her face. The chill had deepened without her noticing, sinking into the spaces between her ribs. She realized, with a start, that the water had crept higher on the rock, a thin, cold line now kissing the toes of her boots. She took a careful step back and watched. Another slow inch of dark spread over the stone. There had been no splash, no visible ripple. The pool simply grew. "Okay, that is enough," Jen said quietly. "We should move. There might be an active siphon feeding this." They retreated single file along the chamber wall, skirting the widening water, until the slope pulled them up and away into another tunnel. The song followed at first, muffled but still present, like it was chewing its way through stone to keep them company. Then, without warning, it cut off mid-phrase. The sudden silence felt heavier than the sound. The next passage narrowed again, forcing them into a sideways shuffling traverse. Somewhere ahead, the rock pinched down to a tight squeeze that Mark promised opened into another room. Victoria focused on her breathing and on the feel of the wall under her palms. It felt solid, indifferent, exactly what she wanted. But as she reached the tightest point, barely enough space for her helmet to clear, another sound washed over her. It was the same hymn, but closer, as if the singers were no longer behind a wall of stone, but standing just around the bend, waiting. The tone was wrong, though. The timing matched the first song, but the leading voice was not one she had heard before. It was her own. The realization slid in like ice water. The lead voice carried her cadence, her slight Appalachian lilt on certain vowels. It sounded calm, almost gentle, singing words she could not make out but knew in her bones were coming from a mouth that matched hers exactly. She could not move for a heartbeat. The rock pressed against her shoulders, the floor against her boots. And still she felt a drop in her stomach, as if she had stepped off into open space. "Do you hear that?" Cole called from behind, his voice tight. "Vic, it sounds like you." She forced herself forward, scraping her ribs along stone, anything to get out of that choke point where her own ghost was leading a song. The passage spat her into a higher crawl where she could at least hunch instead of squeezing. The hymn swelled with her movement, as if it were trying to keep pace. She wanted to tear off her helmet to prove the sound was inside her head, but the rational part of her clung to procedure. Do not remove gear underground. Keep 3 points of contact. Keep moving. When they finally reached the next chamber, a low room with a ceiling dotted by small soda straws, the singing stopped, as abruptly as before. Her own voice cut off mid-syllable, leaving only their harsh breathing and the distant drip of water. Mark looked pale in the reflected glow of their lights. Cole kept glancing back down the tunnel, like he expected someone to crawl in after them. They did not stay long. The planned route was abandoned, with the unspoken agreement that whatever curiosity had brought them here had been satisfied. The way out felt longer than the way in. Every scrape and clink echoed too loudly. Twice, Victoria thought she heard a faint hum behind her, the beginning of that hymn building in her own chest without permission. Each time she swallowed it down and focused on the next foothold. On the surface, the air felt too warm, too bright. They peeled off helmets and sat on the damp grass by the sinkhole in a rough circle. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Finally, Mark pulled the recorder from his pouch and set it between them. The red light had stopped blinking when they left the flooded chamber. He pressed play. The first thing that came through was their own shifting and the soft scrape of boots. Then, clear as if the singers were standing beside the microphone, the hymn began. The sound quality was pristine, no distortion, no static. Victoria felt her skin crawl. Layered voices rose and fell in harmony. 6, maybe 7 of them. They were not random. The melody tracked the exact pattern she remembered. When the recording reached the point where the lead shifted, she braced herself. Her own voice poured from the tiny speaker, strong and sure, singing words she knew she had never learned. Cole swore under his breath and backed away. Jen stared at the recorder, jaw clenched. Mark let the track run until it cut off, then rewound it to the beginning and played it. Again, eyes unfocused. The water on the chamber floor had not been in their imaginations. On the audio, they could hear a soft lapping, growing louder as the song progressed, as if the pool had been rising in time with the hymn. Victoria did not sleep that night. When she closed her eyes, she was back in the squeeze, stone pressing in from all sides, listening to herself lead a congregation she could not see. For weeks afterward, she caught fragments of the melody in ordinary sounds: the hum of her refrigerator, the whistle of a distant train, the murmur of air through the vents at work. She never heard the full song again, but it lived just under the surface of other noises, waiting. She shared the recording only once, with an older caver who had mapped systems across 3 states, and claimed he did not believe in anything he could not survey. He listened without expression, then handed the device back and told her quietly that Chapel Hollow had been off limits for a long time before anyone in her generation picked up a helmet. People had gone in chasing that same singing and had not all come back. Victoria retired from tight squeezes after that. She stuck to show caves and wide galleries, places where the dark felt like a space rather than a presence. The recorder stayed in a drawer, batteries removed, but sometimes, on still nights when the town was quiet and the hills were just black shapes against the sky, she thought she could hear a faint chorus drifting up through the ground. When that happened, she turned on every light in her house and reminded herself that sound could do strange things in the mountains, especially when there were songs the earth was not finished with yet. Andrew had always been the kind of person who needed to finish things. Unread books bothered him. Half-solved puzzles sat in his mind like splinters. When he started caving in his early 20s, that compulsion found a home in the unmapped tunnels that twisted through the Appalachian spine like veins no one had bothered to trace. By 38, he had contributed survey data to 3 major cave systems and had earned a reputation among the regional community as someone who would push a lead until it either opened up or closed down for good. He did not do it for recognition. He did it because incomplete maps felt like unanswered questions, and unanswered questions made his chest tight. The ranger station in Shawnee National Forest was not supposed to have anything interesting. Andrew stopped there on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, killing time before meeting a buddy to check a new sinkhole entrance near the Virginia border. The ranger on duty, a woman in her 50s with sun-damaged skin and tired eyes, was restocking pamphlets when Andrew asked if there were any lesser-known cave systems in the area that might need documentation. She paused, her hand hovering over a stack of trail maps, then disappeared into a back room without a word. When she returned, she carried a single sheet of paper in a plastic sleeve, creased and yellowed at the edges. She set it on the counter between them, but did not let go right away. The map was hand-drawn in faded blue ink, dense with passages and notations that spiraled across the page in a style Andrew recognized immediately as the work of someone who had spent serious time underground. There were elevation markers, compass bearings, and tiny annotations about rock types and water flow, but across the top, in thick red marker that looked far more recent than the original ink, someone had written in block letters, "Do not use, incomplete, hazardous." Andrew leaned closer, tracing the lines with his eyes. The system started with a known entrance he recognized from Forest Service records, but within a few hundred feet the passages split into a maze that did not match anything in the official surveys. Some tunnels dead-ended. Others looped back on themselves in ways that seemed physically wrong. A few simply trailed off the edge of the paper with no indication of where they went. The ranger finally released the map and crossed her arms. She told him it had been turned in by a hiker about 15 years ago, found tucked inside a cairn near the main entrance. No one knew who drew it. The annotations were too detailed to be a prank, but when survey teams tried to follow it, the passages did not line up. Distances were off. Landmarks were missing. After 2 groups reported disorientation and near accidents, the decision was made to archive the map and mark the system as unsafe for recreational exploration. She said she was only showing it to him because he had a reputation for being careful, and she thought he might want to know why certain areas were restricted. Andrew took a photo of the map with his phone, thanked her, and left. He told himself he was just curious. The map was probably drawn from memory by someone who had gotten turned around and filled in gaps with guesswork. It happened more often than people wanted to admit. Memory was a terrible surveyor, but the detail bothered him. The line work was too confident, too precise. It looked like something drawn on sight, not reconstructed later from fragments. 2 days later, Andrew went in alone. He did not tell anyone where he was going. It was a decision he would regret in layers he could not have anticipated, but at the time it felt reasonable. He was only planning to check the first few passages, see if they matched the map, maybe confirm it was unreliable so he could stop thinking about it. He parked his truck at the trailhead just after dawn, packed light with a day pack, helmet, 2 headlamps, backup batteries, water, and a printed copy of the map sealed in a plastic bag. The entrance was a low horizontal crack in a limestone outcrop, half hidden by laurel bushes and just wide enough to crawl through on his stomach. The air that rolled out smelled clean and cold, carrying the faint mineral tang of deep stone. Andrew clipped on his helmet, switched on his primary light, and pulled himself into the dark. The first passage matched the map perfectly. A narrow crawl opened into a walking passage with a ceiling that sloped from 8 feet down to 4 over the course of 20 yards. There was a rock formation on the left that looked like a frozen waterfall. Exactly where the map indicated. Andrew felt a flicker of satisfaction. Whoever drew this had been here. The survey might be incomplete, but it was not invented. He continued deeper, checking his compass and counting his paces to compare against the measurements on the map. The passages split and rejoined in a pattern that felt intentional, like the cave had been designed rather than carved by water. Every junction matched. Every turn came exactly when the map said it would. After 30 minutes, Andrew reached a small chamber, the map labeled as Junction 4. According to the drawing, 3 passages led out. He found all 3 without trouble. That was when he noticed the first change. He pulled the map from his pack to decide which passage to take next, and the paper felt wrong in his hands. Not damp, not torn, just wrong. He spread it flat on a rock and aimed his light at the center. The passages were still there, all the original ink lines and notations, but now there was something new. A 4th tunnel leading out of Junction 4, sketched in the same blue ink with a note beside it that read, "Followed this 11:47 a.m." Andrew checked his watch. It was 11:51. His breath caught in his throat. He turned the map over, looking for some explanation, a second sheet that had gotten stuck, anything. The back was blank. When he flipped it again, the new passage was still there, and now a 5th line had appeared. This one annotated with, "Came back here 11:53. His hand started to shake. He looked up at the chamber walls, counting the exits. There were still only 3. Andrew told himself it was a trick of the light, or his own fatigue playing games with his perception. He had been staring at the map for days. Maybe his brain was filling in details that were not there. He folded the paper carefully and stuffed it back into his pack, deciding it was time to head out. But when he turned toward the passage he had entered through, he could not remember which one it was. They all looked the same now, smooth limestone throats disappearing into black. He pulled the map out again, forcing himself to stay calm. The original entrance route should be marked. He found it, traced the line back toward Junction 4, and his stomach dropped. The map now showed him entering through a passage that did not exist in the chamber. Worse, it showed him standing in a location labeled Junction 6, not Junction 4. The chamber designation had changed while the paper sat in his pack. Andrew backed against the wall, his light sweeping over the ceiling and floor, searching for something familiar, some landmark he could anchor to. The rock gave him nothing. It was all smooth all the same. He checked the map again. A new note had appeared beside Junction 6, written in his own cramped handwriting. "Do not trust the count. Rooms repeat." He had not written that, he was sure. He would have remembered. But the ink matched the pen clipped to his chest pocket, and the slant of the letters was unmistakably his. Panic fluttered at the edges of his focus. He forced it down and started walking, choosing the widest passage because it felt like it should lead somewhere. The tunnel curved gently, sloping downward, then leveled out and opened into another chamber. This one was larger, maybe 15 feet across, with a ceiling high enough that his light barely reached it. He checked the map without thinking. The chamber was already there, labeled Junction 9, with a timestamp beside it that read 12:14 p.m. His watch showed 12:15. The map was updating in real time, drawing passages as he walked them, annotating his movements before he even made them. Andrew tried to tear the paper, to destroy it, but his hands would not cooperate. Some part of him still believed it was the only way out. The passages started to blur together. He walked for what felt like hours, checking the map at every junction and every time it showed him somewhere new. Rooms he had never entered appeared with full detail. Tunnels he had not explored were marked as dead ends or loops. Notes filled the margins in his handwriting, describing fears he had not spoken aloud and decisions he had not yet made. One note read, "The third passage from Junction 12 leads to the room where you will realize you are not leaving." Andrew found Junction 12 without meaning to. It was identical to every other chamber he had passed through. 3 exits, smooth walls, no distinguishing features. He stood in the center and turned slowly, light sliding over stone that gave nothing back. The third passage looked no different from the others, but his legs carried him toward it anyway, pulled by the horrible need to see if the map was right. The passage narrowed as he walked, the ceiling pressing lower until he had to crouch, then crawl. His helmet scraped limestone, and his breath came in short bursts that fogged in the cold. The tunnel ended abruptly at a smooth wall. No continuation, no crack to squeeze through, just solid rock. Andrew sat back on his heels and checked the map one last time. The page was now covered in his handwriting, dense, overlapping notes that spiraled toward the center. Most of it was illegible, frantic loops, and crossed-out words. But in the middle, written in careful block letters, was a single sentence. "Home is behind every door you close." He did not remember crawling back out. The next clear memory was daylight, sudden and brutal, stabbing through his eyelids as hands pulled him from the entrance. A hiker had seen his truck and noticed it had been there for 2 days. Search and rescue had been called. They found him in a shallow alcove just inside the entrance, less than 50 feet from the surface, curled on his side with the map clutched in his fist. When they tried to take it from him, the paper was blank. No ink, no notations, just a yellowed sheet that might have been scrap. Andrew did not go underground again. He moved into a camper van and started driving circuits through the national forests, never staying in one place longer than a few days. He would not sleep indoors. Friends who tried to visit him found that he kept every door in the camper propped open, even in winter, even in rain. When they asked why, he would just shake his head and say the last tunnel was still waiting. He said it was patient. He said it had already drawn the route he would take, written in his own hand. And it was just a matter of time before he opened the wrong door and found himself standing at the entrance again, map in hand, ready to finish what he started. People who knew him before said he had always been the kind of person who needed to finish things. They said it with pity now, watching him stare at closed doors in gas stations and grocery stores, his hand hovering over the handle, lips moving silently as if counting steps he had not yet taken. Some compulsions, they learned, were not meant to be satisfied. Some maps were not drawn to lead you out. They were drawn to show you that leaving had never been one of the options, and the only incomplete thing was your understanding of how long you had already been inside. Natalie came back to Coleridge because she thought stories could save it. The town had been dying slowly for as long as she could remember, bleeding population every census, until the only people left were the ones too old or too stubborn to leave. She'd gotten out at 18, went to college in Asheville, learned video production and folklore documentation, and spent a decade filming other people's vanishing towns. But Coleridge was hers, and when her grandmother died that spring and left her the old house on Pigger Street, Natalie decided it was time to turn the camera on the place that raised her. The project was simple in theory: collect the local legends before the people who remembered them were gone, turn them into a documentary that could live online, a digital monument to a town that would not exist much longer in physical space. She started with the easy ones: the ghost lights on the railroad tracks, the woman in white who walked the cemetery road. But it was the lantern man that made people stop smiling and start looking at their hands. The story went back to the mines, the way everything in Coleridge eventually did. In 1933, a section of the Blackwell seam collapsed during a shift change. 18 men went down. Only 12 came back up. The official report blamed unstable geology and poor ventilation. The families blamed the company for ignoring safety complaints. Either way, 6 men stayed buried under 100 feet of rock and coal, and the mine never reopened. Over the years, the entrance was sealed, the equipment hauled off for scrap, and the forest took back the mountain. But the families never stopped talking about what they saw on the anniversary of the collapse. They called him the Lantern Man because of the light, a single orange glow, dim and steady, moving through the trees near the old Blackwell shaft. Some said it was one of the trapped miners still trying to find his way out. Others believed it was something older, something the men had woken up when they dug too deep. What everyone agreed on was the pattern. The light did not wander aimlessly. It moved with purpose, leading some people back to the trailhead and safety, while driving others deeper into the woods where the ground was unstable and the old ventilation shafts could open under your feet without warning. Natalie recorded 3 interviews with people who claimed to have seen it. The first was a man in his 70s named Earl, whose father had been one of the 12 who survived. Earl said he went up to the old site once in his 20s, curious and half drunk, and got turned around in the dark. He saw the light and followed it for 20 minutes before realizing it was leading him in circles around a sinkhole he had not noticed. When he finally stopped and called out, the light blinked twice and disappeared. He made it back to his truck just before dawn, shaking so hard he could barely turn the key. The second interview was with a retired schoolteacher named Doris, who swore she saw the light lead a search party to a lost hiker in 1987. The hiker had twisted his ankle and crawled into an old access tunnel to get out of the rain. He would have died of exposure if the light had not stopped directly over the entrance, hovering there until the searchers noticed. Doris said the light felt intelligent, patient, like it knew they needed time to understand what it was showing them. The third interview was the one that made Natalie stop sleeping well. A woman named Patricia, younger than the others, only in her 50s, told a story about her cousin who went up to the Blackwell site in 2003 as part of a stupid high school dare. He came back down 3 hours later, face white, refusing to talk about what he had seen. 2 weeks after that, he drove his car into a concrete barrier on Route 9 at 60 miles an hour. No skid marks, no attempt to brake. The autopsy found nothing wrong with him, no drugs, no alcohol. But Patricia said she knew what happened. She said the light had judged him and found him wanting, and whatever it showed him up there made him decide he did not deserve to come back down. Natalie asked what her cousin had done to deserve that. Patricia just looked at her with eyes that had gone flat and said some people carry things that do not show on the surface, and the light knew how to see them. She would not say more than that. Against every piece of common sense she had developed filming in isolated places, Natalie decided to go to the Blackwell site herself. She told herself it was for the project, that she needed B-roll of the location to contextualize the interviews. But really, she wanted to see if the stories were anything more than grief and coincidence dressed up in folklore. She brought 2 friends from college, both of whom had helped her on other shoots and understood how to move quietly in the woods with camera equipment. Their names were Marcus and Jay, and they thought the whole thing was half superstition and half tourism. Natalie did not correct them. They hiked up on a Saturday evening in early November, following an overgrown logging road that switchbacked through oak and pine until it dead-ended at a chain-link fence someone had erected decades ago and never maintained. The fence sagged in places, rusted through in others, and a faded sign wired to the gate read, "Danger, abandoned mine, no trespassing." Beyond it, the ground rose in a rocky slope toward a flat area where the trees thinned, and the earth looked disturbed, darker and looser than the surrounding soil. They ducked through a gap in the fence and climbed toward the old shaft entrance. What remained of it was mostly rubble, a concrete rim half buried in moss and fallen leaves, with a steel grate bolted over the opening. Natalie could feel cold air rising from below, carrying a smell like wet stone and rust. She set up her camera on a tripod and started filming the area while Marcus and Jay explored the perimeter, looking for other points of interest. The light came just as the sun dropped behind the ridge. At first, Natalie thought it was Marcus's headlamp reflecting off something in the trees. But Marcus was to her left, and the light was ahead and to the right, maybe 70 yards upslope. It was orange, not the white-blue of an LED, and it did not move like a person walking. It swayed gently, back and forth, the way a lantern would if someone was carrying it on a long handle. Jay saw it next and called out, asking if someone else was up here. The light did not respond. It just continued its slow drift parallel to their position, neither approaching nor retreating. Natalie zoomed in with her camera trying to get detail, but the focus kept sliding off. The light stayed sharp to her naked eye, but on the viewfinder, it smeared into a blur no matter how she adjusted the settings. Marcus started walking toward it. Natalie told him to stop, but he waved her off, saying it was probably just another hiker or a Forest Service patrol. He moved upslope with his own headlamp on, calling out a greeting. The orange light stopped swaying. For a moment, it hung perfectly still, and then it blinked. Once, twice, 3 times, in slow, deliberate sequence. Then it began moving again, faster now, cutting diagonally up the slope away from them. Marcus followed. Natalie shouted at him to stay with the group, but he was already 20 yards gone, his light bobbing as he climbed over fallen logs and loose rock. Jay cursed and went after him. Natalie was left alone with her camera and the cold air rising from the sealed shaft. She kept filming, panning to follow the 2 headlamps chasing the orange glow up the mountain. They disappeared over a rise, and for 5 minutes Natalie heard nothing but wind in the branches and the distant creak of trees settling. Then Marcus's voice came echoing back, high and tight, yelling for them to get up here now. Natalie grabbed the camera off the tripod and ran, her boots slipping on wet leaves, branches catching at her jacket. When she crested the rise, she found Marcus and Jay standing at the edge of a depression in the ground, both of them staring down into a dark gap no wider than a manhole cover. The orange light hovered directly over it, 5 feet off the ground, motionless. Natalie came up beside them and looked down. The gap led into a vertical shaft, one of the old ventilation tunnels Earl had mentioned. The edges were crumbling, unstable, and if any of them had stepped wrong in the dark, they would have gone straight through. Marcus had stopped less than 3 feet from the edge. The light blinked once more, then rose straight up into the canopy and vanished. No fade, no drift, just gone. The 3 of them stood there, breathing hard, staring at the hole that had almost swallowed someone. Jay asked quietly what the light had been doing. Natalie did not answer because she thought she knew, and the answer made her sick. It had been watching Marcus, waiting to see if he would fall. They hiked back down in silence, and Natalie reviewed the footage that night in her grandmother's kitchen. The orange light showed up clearly for the first 30 seconds, drifting through the trees, distinct and real. Then it blinked, and the moment Marcus started following, the light separated into 2 distinct sources on the recording. One continued upslope. The other stayed behind, hovering near the sealed mine entrance, pointed directly at Natalie's position like it was watching her watch it. She shelved the project after that. The interviews stayed on her hard drive, but she never cut them into anything coherent. A month later, Marcus was killed in a car accident outside Knoxville. He had been driving alone on a clear day when his vehicle crossed the center line and hit an oncoming truck head-on. The police report noted no mechanical failure, no sign of distraction. Jay called Natalie the night she heard, voice shaking, asking if she remembered what Patricia had said about her cousin. Natalie did. She still lives in Coleridge, though she does not film anymore. Sometimes, on the anniversary of the Blackwell collapse, she walks up the old logging road and stands at the fence, looking toward the sealed shaft. She has never seen the light again, but she thinks about the two sources on her recording. The way one followed Marcus, and the other stayed behind. She wonders if it is still there, patient and orange in the dark, waiting to see who comes next and whether they deserve the help it offers or the judgment it delivers. The families were right about one thing. The Lantern Man does lead people out, but only the ones it decides should leave. Michael had been volunteering with the county search and rescue team for 6 years when the sinkhole opened up on the Morrison property. It happened overnight sometime in mid-April, a section of pasture simply collapsing inward and taking half a fence line and one very confused cow with it. The cow survived with a broken leg, which was more than anyone expected, but the hole itself was what brought Michael and the rest of the team out on a Saturday morning, when they would rather have been doing anything else. Sinkholes in this part of Appalachia were common enough that they had a protocol: secure the perimeter, assess the depth, determine if it connected to a known cave system, and decide whether it posed a risk to the surrounding area. Michael rappelled down first because he had the most technical rope experience, and because he did not mind tight spaces the way some of the others did. The drop was nearly 40 feet, straight down through red clay and limestone, opening into a passage that clearly belonged to a much older cave system. His headlamp caught the glint of water at the bottom, a shallow pool that spread across uneven stone, and the air smelled like every other cave he had been in. Cold, damp, mineral-rich, nothing unusual. He radioed up that it was stable enough for a second person, and then he started looking around while he waited for backup. The passage extended in both directions, narrow but navigable, with a ceiling that varied between 6 and 10 feet. To his left, the tunnel sloped downward toward what sounded like running water. To his right, it climbed gently before curving out of sight. Michael was examining the rock formations near the pool when his light swept across something that made him stop moving entirely. High up on the far wall, maybe 12 feet off the ground, was a ledge, and on that ledge, arranged in a neat row, were bones. He counted 4 skulls from where he stood, all facing outward toward the center of the passage, and below them, the unmistakable shapes of rib cages and long bones positioned in seated postures. They were not scattered the way animal remains would be after a flood. They were placed, carefully and deliberately, as if someone had taken the time to stage them. Michael felt his throat tighten. He had done enough recovery work to recognize human skeletal structure, and these were definitely human. By the time the second team member, a woman named Carol, reached the bottom, Michael had already taken preliminary photos and marked the location with GPS. Carol took one look at the ledge and radioed for the sheriff. Protocol shifted immediately. This was no longer a sinkhole assessment. It was a crime scene, and they were standing in the middle of it. Sheriff's deputies arrived within the hour, followed by a forensic team from the state police. Michael stayed below to guide them, pointing out the ledge and explaining that there was no obvious way someone could have climbed up there without equipment. The rock face was smooth, water polished, with no natural handholds. Whoever had placed those remains had used ropes or a ladder, which meant they knew what they were doing and had planned ahead. One of the forensic techs, a quiet man named Stevens, asked Michael if the cave system was documented. Michael told him it was not on any of the local surveys. As far as he knew, this passage had been sealed off from any known entrances until the sinkhole opened it back up. They brought in a portable ladder, and Stevens climbed up to examine the remains more closely. Michael watched from below, his light aimed at the ledge to give Stevens better visibility. The bones were old, Stevens said, probably decades based on the color and condition, but he would need lab analysis to be certain. What bothered him more was the arrangement. Each skeleton sat with its back against the wall, legs extended, hands resting in the lap. Their skulls all faced the same direction, tilted slightly downward as if looking at something in the water below. Stevens took samples and photographs, working methodically, and then he found the first piece of evidence that did not fit the timeline. Tucked beneath one of the skeletons was a coil of nylon rope, bright yellow, the kind used in modern climbing. It showed no significant weathering, no mold, no breakdown that would suggest decades of exposure. Stevens held it up in his gloved hand and looked down at Michael. The expression on his face said everything. This rope was recent, maybe a few years old at most. Someone had been down here long after these people died. The search expanded. Over the next 2 days, the forensic team combed the passage in both directions, documenting everything. They found more evidence of recent activity. Boot prints in dried mud near a side tunnel, pressed deep and clear with a tread pattern that matched a popular brand of tactical footwear sold within the last 5 years. Cigarette butts, half a dozen of them, tucked into a small alcove and protected from water flow. The brand was still being manufactured. A plastic water bottle with a date stamp on the cap from 3 years ago. And finally, in a low crawl space that required Michael to squeeze through on his belly, they found a notebook. The notebook was sealed in a waterproof bag, the kind kayakers used. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, dates, times, and grid coordinates. Michael recognized the format immediately. It was a search and rescue log, the same kind the team used to document their operations. The entries went back 7 years and listed locations throughout the region, caves and sinkholes, and old mine shafts. Beside each location was a notation. Most said clear or no access. But 3 entries, including one for the Morrison property, had a different marking, a simple check mark, followed by the word suitable. Michael felt his stomach turn over. He brought the notebook back to Stevens, who read through it, with a face that grew progressively more grim. One of the deputies recognized the handwriting. He did not say who it belonged to, but he pulled the sheriff aside, and they had a conversation in low voices that made everyone else stop working and watch. When the sheriff came back, he told the team to pack up their equipment and clear the site. The investigation was being escalated, and they were no longer authorized to be involved. Michael went home that night and could not sleep. He kept thinking about the ledge, the way the skeletons had been arranged, the care someone had taken to position them, just so. It was not random. It was not the work of someone panicking or trying to hide evidence quickly. It was methodical, almost ceremonial, and whoever did it had come back multiple times over the years to visit, to maintain, maybe to add to the display. 3 weeks later, the sheriff's department announced an internal investigation into possible misconduct within the search and rescue program. No names were released, but one of the veteran members, a man who had been with the team since its founding and had led dozens of successful recoveries, quietly retired. Michael heard, through unofficial channels, that the man's house had been searched and that they had found maps, detailed topographic maps with caves marked in red ink, far more than anyone would need for legitimate rescue work. The official story was that the bones on the ledge belonged to transients and missing persons from decades ago, people who had fallen into the cave system through old entrances that had since collapsed. Natural deaths, tragic but not criminal. The case was filed as historical and closed, but Michael knew what he had seen. He knew the rope was new, the cigarette butts were recent, and the notebook proved someone had been cataloging these sites with intention. He also knew that search and rescue volunteers had access to reports about missing persons, about people who disappeared while hiking or camping in remote areas, people whose cases went cold because there were no leads and no bodies. He stayed on the team for another year, but he started paying attention to things he had not noticed before. The way certain members always volunteered for specific types of calls, the way some searches were called off earlier than they should have been, the way evidence sometimes went missing from staging areas before it could be properly logged. He started keeping his own records, quietly, taking photos and making notes. When another sinkhole opened up that winter near the Tennessee border, Michael was the first one down, and he found the same thing. A ledge, high and dry, with bones arranged in careful rows. This time he did not report it through official channels. He sent the photos to a journalist in Knoxville who specialized in cold cases and government corruption. The story broke 4 months later, and the investigation went federal. 2 more members of the search and rescue team were implicated, along with a retired deputy who had helped coordinate responses for over a decade. The official count was 11 victims, but Michael suspected there were more, hidden in caves that had not opened yet, waiting in the dark for the next sinkhole or the next flood to expose them. He quit the team after the arrests. He could not look at rope the same way anymore, could not hear a radio call about a missing hiker without wondering if someone was already planning where to put the body. He moved to a city, somewhere flat with no caves, and took a job that kept him indoors and away from the mountains. But sometimes he still dreams about that first ledge, the way the skulls were all turned toward the water, and he wonders what they were positioned to watch. He wonders if whoever put them there stood in the same spot he did, looking up at his work, proud of the display he had created in a place no one was supposed to find. Michael keeps his own maps now, marked with every site he knows about, and some he only suspects. He does not share them with anyone, but he updates them whenever he hears about a new sinkhole or a cave system that suddenly opens after years of being sealed. The official investigations are over. The arrests have been made. But Michael knows how many volunteers pass through search and rescue every year, how many of them learn the landscape, how many earn the trust that lets them go into the woods alone with people who need help. He knows that some of them come back with everyone they went in with, and some of them do not. And he knows that sinkholes keep opening, steady and patient, revealing things the mountains tried to keep. Emma had been caving for 3 years before she learned that some sounds were not made by water or wind. She started with guided tours through commercial caves, the kind with handrails and electric lights, then graduated to wild systems with groups from the regional grotto. By the time she was 25, she felt comfortable in tight spaces and vertical drops, trusted her gear, and had developed the kind of calm that came from understanding that panic underground was the fastest way to get hurt. That confidence made her agree to join a trip into a system called the Chimney Caves, a network of vertical shafts and narrow passages in the mountains outside Beckley, West Virginia. The name came from the main feature, a series of natural air shafts that ran vertically through the limestone, connecting different levels of the cave like chimneys in an old house. Some were wide enough to climb. Others were barely slots, too narrow for a person, but large enough that air moved through them with a low whistle when the pressure changed on the surface. The local cavers talked about the chimney caves with a mix of respect and unease. The system was technical, requiring rope work and careful route finding, but it was also known for strange acoustics, sounds carried in unexpected ways, voices echoed from passages that should have been too far away, and every so often someone would swear they heard something moving in the shafts above them, scraping and breathing in spaces no person could fit. Emma went in with 4 others on a cold Saturday in October. There was Joel, the trip leader, who had been mapping the system for 2 years. There was his partner Kristen, who handled the rigging and had a reputation for being meticulous with safety. A younger guy named Ben, eager and new, who reminded Emma of herself when she started. And finally, there was Marcus, quiet and experienced, the kind of caver who did not talk much but always seemed to know when something was wrong before anyone else noticed. The entrance was a horizontal crack at the base of a limestone bluff, hidden behind a tangle of rhododendron. They squeezed through one by one, helmets scraping stone, and immediately dropped into a hands and knees crawl that lasted 30 yards before opening into the first vertical shaft. Joel rigged the rope and descended first, his voice echoing up that he had reached the bottom and it was clear. Emma went second, rappelling down 60 feet of smooth rock into a chamber where the floor was covered in breakdown and the ceiling disappeared into shadow. The air was cold and smelled faintly metallic, the way caves do when there's a lot of iron in the water. They regrouped at the bottom, and Joel explained the route. They would traverse a series of passages that angled downward, then ascend another shaft that would take them to an upper level where the best formations were. The whole loop would take about 4 hours if they moved steadily. Emma checked her gear, made sure her backup light was accessible, and followed the group into a low passage that forced them to crouch. The first time she heard it, she thought it was her own breathing, a wet, rhythmic sound, like air moving through a congested throat. But her breath was steady, controlled, and the sound was coming from above. She stopped and aimed her light at the ceiling. There was a crack there, maybe 6 inches wide, running parallel to the passage. Air moved through it, cold and steady, and carried with it that wet breathing noise. Kristen noticed her pause and asked if she was okay. Emma nodded and kept moving, telling herself it was just wind over water somewhere in the system. The second time, they were in a wider chamber, taking a break to drink water and check the map. The sound came from a different shaft, this one vertical and too narrow for a person to enter. It started as a faint scrape, like something dragging over stone, then shifted into that same breathing pattern. Ben heard it too and looked up, his light sweeping the ceiling. He asked if there were animals in the cave, maybe bats or raccoons. Joel said bats did not sound like that and raccoons would not go this deep. Marcus did not say anything. He just stood with his head tilted, listening, and Emma saw his jaw tighten. They continued deeper. The passages grew narrower, forcing them to move in single file. Emma was third in line, behind Joel and Kristen, with Ben and Marcus bringing up the rear. The route took them through a series of tight squeezes, places where they had to exhale to fit their chests through gaps in the rock. Emma focused on her breathing, on the next handhold, on not thinking about how much stone was pressing in from all sides. But the sound kept following them. It moved through the shafts, always above, always just out of sight. Sometimes it was ahead of them, sometimes it was behind. And once, when they stopped to rig another rope for a climb, Emma swore it came from directly overhead, close enough that she felt a faint vibration in the rock against her helmet. The ascent to the upper level was a chimney climb, a vertical shaft about 40 feet tall with enough irregularities in the walls that they could brace their backs and feet and inch their way up without ropes. Joel went first, demonstrating the technique, then Kristen followed. Emma waited at the bottom with Ben and Marcus, watching their lights rise into the dark. She was about to start her own climb when something fell from above and landed at her feet. A rock, smooth and round, about the size of a golf ball. Emma picked it up and turned it over in her gloved hand. It was wet, covered in a thin layer of slime that smelled wrong, organic and sharp. She looked up into the shaft. Joel and Kristen were still climbing, their movements steady and controlled. Neither of them had dislodged anything. The rock had come from higher up, from a section of the shaft no one had reached yet. Marcus stepped beside her and took the rock from her hand. He held it under his light, examined it closely, then dropped it like it had burned him. He told Emma quietly that they needed to leave. Now. Before she could respond, the breathing started again. This time it was loud, unmistakable, coming from the shaft directly above them. It was not wind. It was not water. It was something inhaling and exhaling in a rhythm that was almost human but not quite. The timing slightly off, the wetness too pronounced. Ben backed away from the shaft, his light shaking. Marcus grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her toward the passage they had come from, but Joel's voice called down from above, asking what was wrong, telling them to start climbing. Emma made a decision she would regret for the rest of her life. She started climbing. She wedged her back against one wall and her feet against the other, bracing herself, and began inching upward. The technique required focus, constant adjustment, small controlled movements. She could not afford to look up or down, just had to trust that the walls would hold and that her legs would not give out. She was 15 feet off the ground when she felt it. Something moved over her, not beside her, not below, but directly over her back, using the same chimney technique she was using, but in the opposite direction. She felt weight, real physical pressure, pressing down on her shoulders and helmet. She felt the scrape of something hard against her pack. And she heard the breathing, close enough that it was inside her helmet, hot and wet against the back of her neck. Emma froze. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to thrash, to get away. But she was wedged in the shaft, and there was nowhere to go. The thing climbed over her slowly, deliberately, and she felt ridges, something segmented or jointed, pressing into her spine. It smelled like rotting leaves and mineral deposits, sharp and acidic. Then it was past her. The pressure lifted, and the breathing faded upward, toward where Joel and Kristen were waiting. Emma gasped, realizing she'd been holding her breath, and forced herself to keep climbing. Her legs shook so badly she nearly fell twice, but she made it to the top and pulled herself onto the ledge where the others were gathered. Joel asked what had taken so long. Emma could not answer. She just stared at the shaft, watching Ben and Marcus climb up behind her, both of them pale and wide-eyed. Kristen was the one who noticed the rope, the one they had rigged earlier for the descent on the way back. It was hanging in the shaft beside them, and there was a second groove worn into the rock parallel to it, smooth and deep, as if something heavy had been using that route for a very long time. The groove was too uniform to be natural. It was a worn path, polished by repeated contact, and it led up into a side shaft that none of them had noticed before. Too narrow to explore, but clearly large enough for something to move through. Joel said they should document it, take photos, maybe come back with better equipment to investigate the upper shafts. Marcus said absolutely not. He said whatever made that groove did not want company, and the fact that it had climbed over Emma instead of knocking her off the wall meant it was either curious or testing them. Either option was bad. They needed to leave immediately. The group split on the decision. Joel and Kristen wanted to continue the route, see the formations they had come for. Ben, Marcus, and Emma voted to exit. In the end, caution won. They descended the shaft using a different route, one that avoided the chimney climb, and worked their way back toward the entrance. The breathing followed them for a while, moving through the air shafts, parallel to their route, but it never came close again. By the time they reached the surface, it had stopped entirely, leaving only the normal sounds of dripping water and distant wind. Emma reviewed her helmet cam footage that night. The video was mostly useless, just shaky images of rock and darkness, but there was a 10-second stretch during the chimney climb where the camera caught something. The image was distorted, the light blooming and contracting in ways that should not happen with LED. But in the center of the frame was a shape, long, segmented, with too many joints bending in directions that did not match any anatomy she recognized. It moved over the top of the frame and disappeared into the upper shaft, and for just a moment, before the distortion cleared, she saw what might have been a face. Not human, not animal, just a smooth oval with depressions where eyes should have been, turned towards the camera as if acknowledging that it had been seen. She deleted the footage. She told herself it was a glitch, a trick of shadow, an overexposed light. But she never went back to the chimney caves, and when other cavers asked her about the system, she just said the route was too technical for her skill level. Marcus quit caving entirely. Ben moved to Florida, where there were no mountains and no vertical caves. Joel and Kristen did go back, about a month later, and they reported that the upper shafts had collapsed, sealed off by a rockfall that looked recent, but showed no sign of what might have triggered it. The locals still talk about the chimney caves, about the whistling air shafts and the strange acoustics. Some of the older cavers, the ones who have been exploring the system since the 70s, will tell you quietly that the shafts were never empty. They will say that something has been living in the upper levels for longer than anyone has been keeping records. Something that hunts by sound and knows how to move through spaces too small for anything with bones. They will tell you that if you hear breathing in the shafts, you should stop whistling, stop talking, and leave before it decides to come down and see what made the noise. Emma believes them now. She believes that some caves have more than one kind of occupant, and that respect means knowing when you're not wanted. The thing in the air shaft let her live, and she does not plan to test its patience a second time. Daniel was 11 years old when his sister disappeared from a place where disappearing should have been impossible. It happened at Crystal Caverns, one of those family-friendly commercial caves with gift shops and guided tours, the kind of place that advertised itself as perfectly safe for children. His parents had taken them there during a road trip through Kentucky, a detour to break up the long drive between visiting relatives. Sarah was 9, 2 years younger than Daniel, and she had been excited about the cave in a way that annoyed him at the time. She kept asking questions about stalactites and stalagmites, reading every informational plaque out loud, holding his hand whenever the tour guide turned off the lights to show them what real darkness looked like. The group was small that afternoon, just their family and 3 other tourists, led by a guide named Robert, who had been working at Crystal Caverns for 15 years. Robert knew every formation by name, every story about how the cave was discovered, every safety feature that had been installed to keep visitors from wandering into restricted areas. The path was paved, lined with metal railings, lit by strategically placed bulbs that made the limestone glow amber and gold. There were no side passages accessible to the public, no gaps in the railings, no way to step off the designated route without climbing over barriers that were clearly marked. Daniel remembered the moment with a clarity that had not faded in 23 years. They were standing in a chamber called the Cathedral Room, a high-ceilinged space where water dripped from formations that looked like frozen waterfalls. Robert was explaining how the cave stayed at a constant 54 degrees year-round when the lights went out. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had thrown a switch. The darkness was absolute, the kind that pressed against your eyes and made you forget what sight felt like. Daniel heard his mother gasp, heard his father tell everyone to stay calm, heard Robert's voice cutting through the confusion to explain that the backup generator would kick in momentarily. The emergency lights came on maybe 15 seconds later, dim red bulbs spaced along the floor to mark the path. Daniel looked around, blinking against the sudden change, and realized Sarah was not holding his hand anymore. He called her name. His mother turned, scanning the group, and asked where she was. His father checked behind them, thinking maybe she had stopped to look at something. Robert did a head count and came up 1 short. Sarah was gone. The tour turned into a search within minutes. Robert radioed the control office, requesting additional staff and a full lights-on protocol. Within 10 minutes, there were 5 employees combing the cathedral room and the passages on either side. They checked behind formations, under railings, in every corner where a child might have crouched down or wandered. They found nothing. No sign of Sarah, no dropped belongings, no indication that she had left the path. Daniel's mother started crying. His father demanded answers that nobody had. Robert kept repeating that it was impossible, that there was nowhere for her to go, that the cave was a closed loop with only one entrance and exit. The police arrived an hour later, followed by search and rescue teams with dogs. The dogs were brought into the cathedral room and given something of Sarah's descent, a jacket she had left in the car. They circled the area, noses to the ground, and then stopped at a section of smooth wall about 20 feet from where the family had been standing. The handler said the scent trail ended there. Not faded, not scattered, just stopped. as if Sarah had walked up to the wall and ceased to exist. Cave specialists were brought in to examine the rock. They used ground-penetrating radar and acoustic sensors, looking for voids or hidden passages that might have been missed during the initial surveys when the cave was developed for tourism. They found something. A narrow gap behind a section of flowstone, maybe 18 inches wide, that opened into a passage not on any of the official maps. The opening was natural, but had been sealed decades ago with concrete during the construction of the tourist route. Except the concrete had cracked recently, leaving a gap just large enough for a small person to squeeze through. The rescue teams went in immediately. Daniel was not allowed to follow, but he heard the reports later. The passage was tight, unstable, and led to a section of the cave system that had never been fully explored. There were side tunnels, vertical drops, areas where the floor disappeared into water-filled sumps. They searched for 3 days, bringing in specialists from across the region, and found nothing. No clothing, no footprints in the mud, no sign that Sarah had ever been in that passage. The scent trail that ended at the wall could not be explained. The dogs were reliable. The handlers insisted the trail was clear and definitive. But there was nothing beyond the wall except empty stone. The official conclusion was that Sarah had somehow wandered into the unmapped section and become lost in a part of the system they had not yet reached. The search was suspended after 2 weeks, when it became clear that the passage network extended far beyond what was safe to explore. The family was told that the cave would remain closed, pending a full structural review, and that if any evidence was found, they would be contacted immediately. Daniel's parents hired private search teams over the next year. Psychics were consulted, reward money was offered. None of it produced answers. Daniel grew up with a hole in his life shaped like his sister. He went to therapy, learned to function, finished school, and eventually moved away from the town, where everyone knew him as the boy whose sister vanished in the safe cave. But he never stopped thinking about that moment when the lights went out, the feeling of her hand slipping away from his in the dark. He wondered if she had let go or if something had pulled her. He wondered if she had been scared or if it had happened too quickly for fear to register. When he turned 34, the same age his father had been when Sarah disappeared, Daniel went back to Crystal Caverns. The cave had reopened years earlier, after extensive renovations. The crack in the wall had been sealed with steel-reinforced concrete. New lighting systems had been installed with multiple redundancies. The tours now included a safety briefing that emphasized staying with the group at all times. Daniel booked a private tour, told the guide he was a geology enthusiast, and asked to see the cathedral room. Standing there in the steady amber light, surrounded by tourists taking photos, he felt the weight of all the years pressed down on him. He walked to the section of wall where the dogs had stopped, where the scent trail had ended. The new concrete was obvious, a gray patch against the natural stone. He placed his hand flat against it and closed his eyes, trying to feel something, anything, that would tell him Sarah had been real and had existed and had not simply evaporated. That night, back in his hotel room, Daniel woke to the sound of dripping water. He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling, disoriented. The sound was close, rhythmic, exactly like the drip in the cathedral room. He sat up and turned on the lamp. The room was dry. No leak, no source for the sound. But it continued, patient and steady, and beneath it he heard something else. A voice, faint and distant, calling his name. It sounded like Sarah. Not Sarah as she would be now, a woman in her 30s, but Sarah at 9 years old. The same pitch and inflection he remembered from the gift shop before they entered the cave. He told himself it was a dream, exhaustion, the power of suggestion after spending the day in a place thick with trauma. But the voice called again, clearer this time, and it was coming from the wall. Daniel got out of bed and pressed his ear against the drywall. On the other side, muffled by insulation and distance, he heard her asking where he was, asking why he had let go of her hand, asking him to come help her because she could not find the way out, and it was so dark and she was tired of waiting. Daniel packed his things and left the hotel before dawn. He drove 6 hours straight, putting distance between himself and the cave, but the voice followed him. He heard it in the hum of the car engine, in the static between radio stations, and the hollow echo of his own apartment when he finally made it home. He started keeping every light on, even during the day, because the voice only came when things got too dark. And at night, when he could not avoid sleep, he dreamed of his sister standing in a passage that had no end, her hand reaching out toward him, always just beyond his grasp. Years later, Daniel received a call from the Park Service. Maintenance workers had been doing repairs in a sealed section of Crystal Caverns and had found something. A purple backpack, the kind a child would carry, wedged in a crevice high above the floor in a chamber that had no official access. Inside was a school notebook with Sarah's name written on the front in their mother's handwriting. The pages were filled with drawings, crude sketches of tunnels and rooms, dated weeks and months after she disappeared. The final page had a message written in pencil, shaky and faint. It said she could hear him calling, but she could not find the door. It said the cave kept changing and the lights would not stay on. It said she was sorry for letting go. The handwriting was analyzed and matched Sarah's samples from before the disappearance. The notebook itself showed no sign of water damage or aging that would be consistent with spending years in a cave environment. It looked like it had been placed there recently, though the chamber had been sealed since before Sarah was born. The case was reopened briefly, then closed again when no further evidence could be found. Daniel was told it was likely a hoax, cruel and inexplicable, but not evidence of anything supernatural. He keeps the notebook now in a drawer he does not open often. Sometimes, late at night, he takes it out and reads the final message, tracing the loops of her handwriting with his finger. He thinks about the scent trail that ended at a solid wall, about the dogs who were never wrong, about the passage that should not have existed. He thinks about the moment the lights went out and how quickly a hand can slip away in the dark. And he wonders if the cave did not take Sarah so much as she stepped into a version of it that was never meant to connect with the world he lived in, a place where the exits moved and the darkness had depth, and the only way out was to become part of the stone. Daniel does not go into caves anymore. He does not even like basements or parking garages anywhere the light feels conditional. But sometimes he still hears her voice, faint and patient, asking him to come find her. And sometimes, when he is alone and the room is very quiet, he hears himself answer, whispering into the dark that he is looking, that he has always been looking, and that he is sorry he let go. The cave does not answer back. It never does. But he knows it is listening, the way it listened 23 years ago, when a 9-year-old girl stepped into a shadow that swallowed her whole and never gave her back. Some places do not just take, they erase. And the worst part is not knowing if she is still there, waiting in the version of the cave that only she can see, or if she stopped being anywhere at all the moment the lights came back on and he realized her hand was gone. Madison had always trusted paper more than people. Numbers made sense to her. Lines on graphs and neat columns in field notebooks, the kind of order that did not lie the way memories could. It was why she chose geology over something softer when she went to college, and why she signed up for the cave mapping project in eastern Tennessee the first chance she got. The work sounded simple on paper. Spend weekends underground with a small team, updating old surveys of an Appalachian cave system that had not been properly mapped since the 1980s. Measure passages, log formations, correct errors, and hand the data over to the state. She joined a team of 5. The lead mapper, an older caver named Greg, had been surveying systems for 30 years and treated the cave like a living thing whose anatomy he understood better than his own. There was Leah, a biology grad student, cataloging cave fauna. A quiet guy named Trent, who handled the laser rangefinder and compass. A sophomore called Tyler, who carried gear and tried too hard to impress everyone. And Madison, with her notebook, her love of clean data and her belief that the underground followed rules like everything else. The cave they were working in had a name on the map, and half a dozen different ones in town. Officially, it was called Chestnut Ridge Cave. Locals called it Devil's Ledger, the Ledger, or just the Crawl, because most of the known system was low and tight, forcing anyone who went in to get intimate with the mud. The entrance was a shallow sinkhole choked with leaves and briars, leading to a vertical drop, and then a long, miserable belly crawl that opened into a series of low rooms and twisting passages. It was not a tourist cave. It took effort to get there and stubbornness to stay. On the 5th weekend of the project, they were working a section of side passages that had been sketched crudely on the old survey but never shot properly. The ceiling was rarely more than 3 feet high, and the floor was a mix of slick clay and knobbly limestone that scraped knees through pads. They moved slowly, setting temporary stations, taking measurements, double-checking each shot because the margins for error were small and the network of crawls tangled easily in the mind. Madison was in the lead when she saw the glint. They had just pushed through a particularly miserable squeeze, a slot barely wider than her shoulders, when her headlamp caught on something that did not look like rock or mud. It was wedged sideways in a shallow depression along the wall, half buried in silt. She almost crawled past it before her brain registered the straight line that did not belong. She backed up, ignoring the muttered protest from Tyler behind her, and brushed the silt away with a gloved hand. The object was a notebook, the cheap spiral-bound kind you could buy in any campus bookstore. Its cover was coated in a thin shell of calcite like a candy glaze, but the paper inside looked intact, protected by the mineral crust. Madison stared at it for a long moment, her heart beating faster. It should not have been there. This crawl had no other entrances, no obvious place where someone could have dropped a notebook and left. And yet it was here, in a spot just narrow enough that you could only pass one at a time. She eased it out carefully and called back to the others that she had found something. They backed out into a slightly wider pocket where they could sit hunched instead of lying flat. Madison held the notebook between her hands like it might disintegrate if she moved too fast. The calcite flaked away easily under her fingers, revealing a damp but readable cover. Her name was written on it in black marker, not just her first name but her full name. The letters were neat, the marker strokes slightly faded, as if they had been written years ago and then sealed away. For a second, Madison thought it was some elaborate joke. She looked from face to face, waiting for someone to crack up and admit they had planted it to mess with the new person. But Greg just frowned. Leah's eyes went wide. Tyler swore under his breath, and Trent stared at the notebook like it was a snake. Madison flipped it open with hands that did not feel like hers. The first page was filled with writing in pencil, cramped lines running right to the edges. The handwriting was familiar. Too familiar. The looping tails on certain letters, the way the T's were crossed low and hard. It was her own handwriting. She read the first few sentences, then had to stop and swallow against the dryness in her throat. The entry described their route into the cave that morning in precise detail. The weather topside, what time they had left the cars, the way Tyler had slipped on the mud at the first drop and laughed it off. It mentioned a joke Leah had made about cave crickets, something no one outside that group would know. The timestamp at the top of the page was 9:18 a.m., 30 minutes earlier. "Okay," Tyler said, voice too loud in the low space. "Nope. No way. Somebody's messing with us." Greg took the notebook gently and turned a few pages. The entries continued, each one stamped with a time that matched within minutes what Madison could see on her own watch. They were narrating the day in real time, describing things that had just happened and things that had not yet happened. On page 3, in her own careful script, Madison read, "We find the notebook in the crawl and pretend it is some trick. Greg will say we should take it out and bag it. Leah will say we should read ahead. I will say we should not." "That is not funny," she whispered, even though nobody was laughing. They sat together in the cramped pocket, their headlamps creating harsh, overlapping shadows, and argued quietly about what to do. Leah wanted to keep reading. If the notebook knew what was going to happen, they could avoid problems before they started. That was data, in its own terrifying way. Greg argued for treating it like evidence in an accident investigation. Bag it, tag it, get it to someone topside who could look at it in better conditions. Trent said very little, but he did not stop staring at Madison like she might vanish if he blinked. Madison listened to them talk and then flipped ahead against her own better judgment. Near the middle of the notebook, the handwriting changed. It was still hers, but the lines were shakier, the words more cramped, letters pressed into the paper so hard they nearly tore it. An entry halfway through the book was dated 3 days from now. It described an accident. It said she would be separated from the group in a different crawl, one that had not yet been mapped. It said a section of ceiling would collapse behind her, blocking the way out. It said her light would fail sooner than it should. And it said she would have 3 hours of air, maybe 4, before the bad air in the pocket built up enough to make her sleepy. Beneath that, an entire page was filled with the same sentence over and over. Do not go left at the fork beyond Station 12. The words blurred together, graphite and pressure and desperation. She looked up, her heart pounding against her ribs. Where are we relative to Station 12? She asked Greg. He blinked, pulled out the survey sketch, and traced their position with a muddy finger. We are approaching it, he said slowly. Another 50 feet of crawl, then a small junction. Left goes to the unshot section. Right loops back to the main route. Madison turned the page. The next entry, time stamped 20 minutes ahead of their current time, described the junction. It said she would argue for going right. It said Greg would insist on going left because we are here to map the parts nobody has bothered with. It said she would feel pressure to agree. She closed the notebook and held it against her chest. The mud under her knees felt suddenly too soft, like something alive shifting under a thin skin of stone. We go right, she said. We stay on known passage. We get this thing out of the cave and figure out what it is in daylight. Greg opened his mouth, probably to argue, but his headlamp flickered once, twice, then steadied. Something in his expression changed. He nodded. Right, he said. Fine, right. They crawled on, the notebook sealed in a dry bag and clipped to Madison's harness. When they reached Station 12, the fork looked exactly like the sketch. A narrow left-hand passage diving into black. A slightly wider right-hand passage angling up toward where Madison knew the main route lay. For a second, the left tunnel seemed to breathe, exhaling a cooler draft that brushed her face and tugged imperceptibly at her clothing. She did not look at it again. She led them right. The rest of the survey went strangely smooth. They tied back into known stations faster than expected. The measurements lined up. There were no equipment failures, no navigation errors, no close calls with loose rock. But the notebook weighed on her like an extra pack. Every time her hand brushed it, she imagined the graphite words reshaping themselves inside, writing new futures in her own script where she made different choices and paid for them. Back on the surface, they stood around the tailgate of Greg's truck while the late afternoon light slanted through the trees. Madison opened the dry bag and lifted out the notebook. The cover was drier now, the paper swelling a little but still legible. She flipped to the middle, to the entry that had warned her about the collapse. It was gone. The pages were still full, the handwriting still hers, but the narrative had changed. The entry for that time now described them reaching Station 12, considering the left-hand crawl and choosing right. There was no mention of a collapse, no repetition of the warning not to go left. The frantic graphite gouges were gone, replaced by neat lines that felt like they had always been there. Maybe you misread it, Tyler said, but he would not meet her eyes. Leah suggested stress. Flashing lights in tight spaces played tricks on perception. It was possible, she said gently, that Madison had seen what she feared most rather than what was actually on the page. Greg did not say much. He just took the notebook carefully and flipped through it, scanning entries, his brow furrowed. At the very back, on the inside cover, he stopped. "Madison," he said quietly, "you should see this." She took the notebook back and looked. Written along the inside of the back cover, in the same pencil and the same hand, was a final note. The letters were faint, as if written in low light with a dull point. "This is not the first version," it read. "You do not remember the others. I'm trying to get it right. Please listen next time." She closed the cover slowly. The air on the ridge felt thinner suddenly, the sky too bright. Leah asked what it said, but Madison just shook her head and slipped the notebook into her own pack. She said she would transcribe it later, get the useful field data out, and then maybe they could figure out if it was an elaborate prank or something stranger. Nobody argued. The day had gone on too long. Weeks passed. The project continued. They finished Chestnut Ridge and moved on to another system, but Madison kept the notebook with her. She locked it in a drawer in her apartment and tried not to think about it. She dreamed of crawl spaces that shifted when she was not looking, of forks in the dark that led to the same place no matter which way she went. In some dreams, she remembered choosing left and heard rock crack behind her. In others, she remembered dying. One rainy night, unable to sleep, she took the notebook out again. The pages were dry now, brittle at the edges, but the writing was still clear. She skimmed through, looking for the back cover. Note, the plea from whatever version of her had written it. It was gone. In its place was a new line, one she was sure had not been there before. "I think this one worked," it read. "I hope you never remember why." Madison put the notebook back and shut the drawer. She did not lock it this time. In the morning, she ordered a fireproof box, and when it arrived, she placed the notebook inside and sealed it. She told herself she was being silly, that it was just paper and pencil, and a brain that had spent too much time in the dark, but she also stopped leading in tight crawls after that. She let someone else go first, someone who believed that time moved in only one direction, and that choices, once made, did not echo backward to rewrite the path that led there. On maps, caves were clean lines and junctions fixed and certain. Underground, Madison had learned they were something else. They were stories told in stone, revised over millennia, branching and collapsing, erasing and rewriting their own roots. Maybe, she thought, people who spent too much time inside them began to pick up that habit. Maybe some part of her had refused to accept one version of events and had kept scratching at the walls of reality until a new passage opened. Whatever the explanation, she knew two things. The notebook told the truth, and the truth could change. And somewhere in the dark between Station 12 and that left-hand crawl was a version of her who had not listened in time, scribbling warnings she would never remember, in a journal that always seemed to find its way back to the same narrow pocket in the rock, waiting for the next chance to get it right. Matthew took the night job at Ridgeview Caverns because he thought caves would be quieter than prisons. After 10 years as a corrections officer in Virginia, he was tired of concrete echoes and metal doors slamming, tired of raising his voice over men who had learned to weaponize noise. Ridgeview promised something different, a tourist cave tucked into a fold of the Appalachian foothills, with guided tours by day and stillness by night. His main duties as security: monitor the new motion and sound sensor system, lock up the gift shop, make sure no teenagers snuck in after hours to drink beer under the stalactites. The manager, a wiry man named Collins, walked him through the control room on his first evening. Banks of monitors showed live feeds from cameras mounted along the tour path. A digital map displayed the cave's main route in green and its sealed side passages in red. Tiny icons marked motion sensors, temperature probes, microphones. "System cost more than I make in a year," Collins said, tapping the map. "We installed it after some incidents. Kids sneaking off, folks claiming they heard things in closed sections. Insurance wanted proof we were on top of it. Matthew nodded. He understood liability. He understood needing to show you had done everything right, even when you suspected something was fundamentally wrong. He skimmed the incident reports in a battered binder, while the last tour of the day filed out. 10 years of minor trouble, vandalism, stolen souvenirs, the occasional drunk who tried to wander off route, and then clustered in a 3-year window about 5 years back, something uglier. 3 separate assaults near the cave entrance after closing time. 2 victims were local teens who had snuck in. 1 was a woman who had stayed late to photograph formations. All 3 described being lured deeper into shadow by a voice they thought was a friend or guide calling their name. None of them saw their attacker clearly. The cases were under investigation and then quietly labeled inactive. The new sensor system had been installed right after the 3rd attack. His first week was uneventful. He checked doors, watched the monitors, walked the empty paths, with his flashlight sweeping over railings and dripstone. The cave at night was different than during the day. Without the murmur of tourists, every small sound stood out: the drip of water, the distant groan of settling rock, the soft rush of underground air. It felt less like a tourist attraction and more like something older, patient, tolerating the lights because it had no real choice. On the 8th night, the system woke up. Matthew was in the control room, sipping coffee, when a soft chime sounded, and a section of the digital map flashed yellow. Audio anomaly, Section D, the screen read. One of the microphones along the route had tripped a threshold. He put on the headphones and cued the buffer. At first, he heard only the drip and hum he had grown used to. Then a voice emerged, faint but distinct. It was a woman, maybe late 20s from the sound of her, saying, "Is anyone still down here?" The tone was cautious but not frightened, like someone who had just realized the lights were dimmer than they should be. Matthew checked the camera for Section D. Video showed an empty stretch of walkway, railings, stone. No one there. He replayed the audio. Same voice, same words. No variation in background noise, no spatial change. It sounded less like live speech and more like a clip being played in a room with constant conditions. Glitch, Collins said when Matthew mentioned it the next day. System is still new. Software probably misfired and flagged some recorded tour audio. Matthew wanted to believe that. But the next night, another anomaly popped up. Different section, different microphone. This time it was a man's voice, tense and low. "Do not go that way. I heard something." The words came through clear, as if spoken a few feet from the mic. The camera showed nothing but an empty corner where the path curved around a column. He went back through the incident reports. One of the assault victims, the photographer, had told police she heard a man in the dark warning her away from the side path near the old side entrance. She had turned toward the voice and walked into someone's hands instead. The system flagged 3 more anomalies over the next week. Voices, always alone, always in sections that should have been empty long after closing. The words were different each time, but a pattern emerged. The voices said things that would make a person change direction, hesitate, turn their back to where they had just been. "Come look at this. Wait up, I dropped something. I think I saw someone over there." Tour guides wore microphones for educational spiels, and the cave played pre-recorded safety messages in the lobby. Matthew wondered if the sensor system was somehow pulling from that archive and misrouting audio into the live feed. Collins claimed that was impossible. Different networks, physically separate. The anomalies were logged and forwarded to the security company that had installed the system. Their tech support suggested recalibration, maybe some environmental interference. Then the motion alert started. At 11:23 p.m. on a Wednesday, a motion sensor near the sealed West Passage triggered. The map flashed red, and one of the monitors automatically switched to the corresponding camera feed. An empty railing, a sign reading "Staff Only," and the black mouth of a locked gate. No movement. The alert cleared after 5 seconds. 30 minutes later, the same sensor tripped again, and again the camera showed nothing. No drifting insect, no falling condensation, just empty space. The next night, a different sensor triggered along the main route, directly under one of the microphones that had picked up a voice 2 days earlier. Matthew watched the feed live, eyes flicking between the map and the camera. For a moment, the air in the frame seemed to shimmer. The light from the walkway bulbs warped, a subtle distortion like heat waves above asphalt. The motion alert cleared, and the image snapped back to normal. He pulled the video and watched it frame by frame. The shimmer was there, a faint, humanoid distortion about the height and width of a person, crossing from one side of the path to the other. No defined edges, no features, just a soft displacement of light, like the cave itself had inhaled and shifted. He did not show that clip to Collins. Instead, he started mapping the anomalies himself. He printed the cave layout and marked each voice, each unexplained motion, each shimmer. A cluster formed near the entrance. Another along a curve in the path where one of the assaults had occurred. A third around an old sealed doorway that led to a retired section of the system no longer on the tour. The retired section bothered him. On the oldest survey maps in the office, it was labeled Echo Loop, a long, narrow passage that curved back on itself in a crescent, with poor air and bad footing. The tour used to go through it decades ago when safety standards were looser. Visitor complaints about disorientation and panic were frequent. People reported hearing things behind them that turned out to be their own words, bouncing back in distorted form. The loop was sealed in the 90s, after a partial collapse damaged the walkway. On a hunch, Matthew pulled the audio from the last week of tours and scrubbed through clips where visitors lingered near the sealed Echo Loop door. He listened to families posing for photos, kids complaining they were cold, guides giving history. And beneath that, faint but insistent, he began to pick out patterns. Some phrases echoed with more clarity than others. Casual remarks hung in the air longer than they should, repeating softly at the edges of audibility. But in a few instances, the timeline did something that should have been impossible. A visitor would stop, look toward the sealed door, then say, "I swear I just heard myself say that," even though the recording showed no prior instance of those words. In another clip, a teenage boy laughed and blurted, "What if the cave is talking back?" A full 2 seconds before a distorted version of his own laughter came through the mic, stretched and slowed. Matthew listened to that one 3 times. The laugh echoed before it was made. Sleep became difficult. His nights were filled with monitors and voices. During the day, he read everything he could find about infrasound, acoustic anomalies, psychological suggestions. He tried to convince himself the cave's geometry was creating some kind of feedback loop, a natural delay that his brain was misinterpreting as reversed cause and effect. Then the new attacks began. The first was a local kid, 19, who broke into the cave after hours with 2 friends. They hid in the woods until the last staff car left, then slipped through a maintenance door that had not latched properly. Matthew was on patrol deeper inside and did not see them pass the entrance cameras. According to the friends' statements, they only planned to take some photos and dare each other to walk a section with their lights off. At some point, they got separated. Both surviving kids told the same story. At the fork, near the old Echo Loop door, they heard their friend's voice calling from around the bend, saying, "You have to see this. It is crazy." They joked that he was trying to freak them out. They followed anyway. They heard him laugh once more, close enough that it echoed off the railing. Then a third voice, deeper, said something they could not make out. After that, only the sounds of their own panicked footsteps and the staccato beeping of a motion alert they did not understand. Matthew found the 2 huddled near the entrance, bleeding from scrapes, shaking. The missing boy was discovered an hour later by sheriff's deputies, unconscious at the base of a drop in an off-limits side tunnel, head split from hitting rock on the way down. The fall had been just far enough to do serious damage, not far enough to be instantly fatal. He survived, but woke up with no clear memory of how he got there. He remembered hearing his friends calling him from behind, remembered turning to answer, remembered his own voice echoing from somewhere ahead. The rest was a blur of darkness and falling. Security tightened. Maintenance checked every lock. Staff did another round of media interviews, emphasizing safety and condemning trespassing. Privately, Collins asked Matthew if the system had recorded anything unusual that night. Matthew gave him the sanitized report, the motion alerts, a few audio flags with indistinct noise, but left out one clip. It was from a microphone near the echo loop door, time-stamped 3 minutes before the fall. It captured 3 separate voices. The first was the missing boy, saying, "You have to see this. It is crazy." The second were his friends, laughing and swearing in the distance. The third was Matthew's own voice, clear as if he were standing there, saying quietly, "Do not follow him." He had been in the control room at the time, not in the cave. The system, however, had him on file. Part of his job was to record updated safety messages, reminders to stay behind the railings, to keep kids close, to report injuries to staff. His voice was in the archive. The cave had access to it every time a speaker played a pre-recorded announcement. After that, Matthew stopped using the preset safety tracks. He made announcements live, even when it made his throat hurt. He did not like the idea of his voice existing in a library the cave could remix at will. He also stopped walking the paths in total silence. On patrol, he hummed tunelessly under his breath, trying to drown out any faint whispers the microphones might be catching. It did not always work. Sometimes he heard delayed fragments of his own humming from sealed corridors, shifted in pitch, returned as something that almost sounded like another man. His breaking point came on a stormy night in March. Thunder rolled overhead, shaking loose dust from the ceiling. The sensors were jittery, flagging minor vibrations as possible motion. The map flickered with yellow alerts. Matthew acknowledged and cleared them, used to the noise. Then one alert came in red, not yellow. Complex event, Zone A. The entrance. The monitors switched automatically. The camera showed the main lobby tunnel, the heavy steel door at the top of the ramp, and the dark beyond. Inside, on the walkway just past the threshold, stood a shape. It was that same distortion he had seen before, a humanoid smear in the air, bending the light from the overhead fixtures. It was taller now, more defined. As he watched, it took a step forward. The motion sensor registered the movement and chimed. The microphones picked up sound. "Do not open the door," his own voice said in the headphones, calm and level. He stared at the feed. The door was closed. The lobby above, according to the building cameras, was empty. No one stood outside. But the distortion on the screen reached for the handle anyway, its outline blurring as it moved. In the headphones, his voice spoke again, this time more urgent. "Do not open it. Do not open it. Do not..." The door on the monitor jolted as something heavy hit it from the outside. The lobby camera, a separate angle, showed nothing, just an unmoving door. But the audio down below recorded 3 more impacts, each harder than the last, as if someone or something was trying to force its way in. Matthew did not move. He sat in the control room chair, hands gripping the armrests, heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. The impacts stopped. The distortion on the entrance camera lingered a moment longer, then slipped backward into the dark, like heat retracting from a cooling surface. The alert cleared. He put in his notice the next day. Collins tried to keep him, offered different shifts, fewer nights, more time in the office. Matthew shook his head. He told him the truth, or at least the part of it he thought someone else might be able to live with. He said the cave was not just bouncing sound around. It was learning patterns. It was taking voices and phrases and behavior and building a set of tools. First, it used noise to confuse people, to lure them into blind spots where a very human predator waited. Now that predator was gone, arrested in a quiet sweep 2 years before Matthew arrived, a former deputy who had used his access to the cave to stage his attacks. But the cave had kept the methods. "It is still calling," Matthew said, folding his uniform shirt for the last time. "And one day it is not going to need anyone on the other end of the path when folks follow." He moved to a small apartment in a town with no tourist caves, no karst topography, nowhere for sound to travel far underground. He took a day job reviewing security footage for a warehouse, a different kind of watching. Still, some nights when he closes his eyes, he hears delayed echoes of conversations he has not had yet, his own voice advising him against choices he has not made. In those moments, he remembers the shape at the door and the way the cave used him like a recorded warning it could turn on or off at will. Ridgeview Caverns, rebranded after he left. New logo, new slogan, more emphasis on family-friendly fun. The brochure boasts about state-of-the-art monitoring that keeps guests safe. If you listen closely to the promotional video, you can hear Matthew's voice in the background, reminding visitors to stay on the path. He never recorded that line, but the cave did not need him to. In interviews, Collins says the old incidents are behind them, that the bad actor is gone and the system works. Maybe he believes it. Maybe he thinks the echoes on his radios are just interference. Matthew knows better. Some environments do not just reflect sound. They learn from it. They wait in the quiet, piecing together enough of a human pattern to speak with a borrowed voice, just convincing enough to make someone take 2 extra steps into the dark. Abigail used to think urban legends were just rough drafts of real history. Someone saw something once, then fear and time sanded the edges down until only a spooky campfire story was left. That belief was why she started her channel in the first place. Deep dives into regional folklore, matching old tales with court records, missing persons reports, anything that could anchor a ghost story to the real world. Hollow Ridge was supposed to be just another episode. Instead, it became the one she never uploaded. The legend was simple, the way the oldest ones always were. In the late 1970s, a group of college kids hiked into the Appalachians to camp near the mouth of an unmapped cave. They were last seen at a gas station 2 towns over buying beer and marshmallows and laughing too loud. A week later, rangers found their camp at Hollow Ridge. 4 tents, 3 lawn chairs, a ring of stones around a pile of ash that was still faintly gray. Everything was in its proper place, coolers closed, sleeping bags laid out, boots lined up neatly by each tent flap. The only things missing were the campers themselves. No bodies, no blood, no sign of struggle. Just gear waiting for people who never came back to claim it. Over the years, details accreted like mineral on stone. Some said the coffee in the percolator was still warm. Others swore a tape recorder in one of the tents was found with the last 5 seconds worn thin, as if something had been recorded and erased over and over again. The cave at Hollow Ridge became one of those places locals warned kids away from without explaining why. Abigail and Josh drove in on a gray afternoon in late September, following an unmarked forest road that her research notes described as passable with high clearance. Her SUV complained but made it. The plan was simple: hike in, set up their own camp in roughly the same area as the original, film B-roll before dark, then shoot interviews to camera at night with the cave mouth behind them. They had done this a dozen times in other places. The ingredients were familiar, only the mountain was new. The Hollow Ridge Trail was more suggestion than path, a faint depression in the ground marked here and there by blazes someone had painted on trees decades ago. The air was cooler than it should have been for early fall, with a damp bite that clung to the back of the throat. Abigail walked ahead with a GPS, Josh behind, with the tripod and camera case, both of them breathing just hard enough to fog the air when they stopped. They found the old campground, exactly where the topo map said it would be. A flat shelf of ground just below the ridgeline, ringed by hemlock and laurel, 30 yards from a cave mouth that gaped dark in the slope. Time had done its work. No tents, no chairs, no traces of the original camp. But the clearing still felt arranged somehow, as if it had been waiting to be reset. "Kinda perfect, right?" Josh said, dropping the tripod. "Case. It even has a creepy natural amphitheater vibe." They set up their tents in a loose semicircle, just like the crime scene sketch Abigail had studied. Two closer to the fire ring, one a little back under a tree. She hated how easy it was to mimic the layout. It felt like they were stepping into someone else's outline. Still, she told herself, accuracy made for better storytelling. They built a new fire ring inside the old stones, gathered downed wood, and had flames going by dusk, smoke curling up toward a sky thickening with clouds. They filmed the daytime segments first. Abigail stood by the cave mouth, hair pulled back against the damp breeze, and talked at the lens about missing person statistics, about the way the 70s had been a wild mix of new freedoms and poor record-keeping. She pointed to the dark behind her, talked about caves as liminal spaces, thresholds between safe and unsafe maps, between what was known and what was guessed. Josh monitored audio, occasionally stepping in to adjust her collar mic or remind her to repeat a line. By the time they finished, the last light had drained from the trees. Night came down fast on the ridge, a curtain dropping rather than a slow fade. They ate in their camp chairs, the fire crackling between them, the cave opening a flat black absence beyond. The woods around them were quiet in that particular way mountains can be when the weather is about to turn. No insects, no wind, just a heavy stillness. Abigail suggested they prep the night shoot. The plan was to recreate the original campers' last known hours. Laughter around the fire, then a final segment where she would walk toward the cave while narrating the legend's various endings. As a gimmick, she had printed a series of stills from a microfilmed newspaper article, grainy photos of the original camp, tents and chairs, and a cooler with a dent in the side. "Look at this," Josh said, holding one up closer to the fire. "We nailed the layout." The photo showed 4 tents, a central fire pit, and a line of gear on the ground, a lantern, a folded camp chair, a metal box. In the flicker of their own flames, Abigail noticed something she had not seen in the archive. There was a dark shape in the cave mouth behind the tents, just at the edge of the frame. It might have been shadow. It might have been a figure. She leaned closer. The newsprint dots blurred. Whatever it was easy to dismiss. She told herself she was tired, that priming herself with legend always made her see patterns. She set the photo aside and reached for the next one. Halfway through the stack, she froze. One of the stills showed a wide shot of the campsite from above, probably taken by a ranger standing on the ridge. The tents in that photo were not the 70s, A-frame canvas she expected, but dome tents, modern synthetic fabric, one of them with the same two-tone color combination as her own. There was a hard plastic cooler with a familiar logo on the lid, a tripod, a camera case, and 2 figures, armored in jackets, frozen mid-step as they walked toward the fire, figures whose outlines looked uncomfortably like hers and Josh's. The caption beneath the photo, half cut off by the printer, read, "Authorities declined to release names of the 2 most recent individuals found missing from Hollow Ridge Camp." "This is not funny," she said, her voice thin. "Did you mess with these?" Josh put his hands up, confusion real in his eyes. "Abby, I didn't touch your research. You printed those at your place, remember? You texted me complaining about the library copier." They spread the photos on a flat rock, weighing the corners with stones to keep the breeze from flipping them. In some, the camp was clearly 70s vintage. In others, time seemed to smear, old cars, new gear, faces they did not recognize, blurred by newsprint and age. And in 3 of the stills, at different angles and distances, there were 2 figures whose posture, height difference, and clothing matched theirs almost exactly. "Maybe they did some reenactment photos for a later article," Josh offered, desperation creeping into his tone. Like an anniversary piece? Abigail flipped the page over. The back was blank. No later dates, no extra notes, just newsprint and the faint imprint of the image bleeding through. The fire popped, sending a fountain of sparks up into the trees. The cave mouth held its darkness, a perfect oval carved out of the slope. Abigail became aware of how their gear was arranged around the flames. The tents, the chairs, the cooler, the tripod, they matched the photos exactly. "Let us just get the night shot done," she said, forcing steadiness. "We can argue about print anomalies in the morning." They set up the camera, framing the cave mouth behind her, and Abigail began the scripted piece. She talked about time loops in folklore, about cursed locations repeating patterns, about the human need to see ourselves in other people's disappearances. She was halfway through a sentence about ritual when she heard it. A faint click from the trees behind the camera, the sound of a shutter. She stopped speaking. Josh looked up from the monitor. "Did you hear?" Another click, closer this time, off to the side. Abigail turned slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The woods were a lattice of shadow and trunk, nothing moving. "Probably a branch," Josh said too quickly. Abigail nodded like she believed him and finished the segment. Her voice sounded wrong to her own ears, too flat, like she was playing the role of herself. When they reviewed the footage on the small monitor, the audio carried not just her narration but a faint, overlapping whisper track that did not belong. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Josh leaned in, headphones on, brow furrowing. It was their dialogue. Not exactly, but close. Phrases they had said. Earlier on the hike-in, fragments of jokes, half-finished thoughts. The words were slightly out of order, as if someone had recorded their whole day and was now scrubbing back and forth over the tape, letting random bits leak into the present. "Glitch in the mic," Josh said, taking the headphones off and setting them down with more force than necessary. "We will fix it in post." They went to bed around midnight, each retreating to their separate tents. The fire burned down to embers. The woods grew still again. Abigail lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the ticking of cooling metal from the camp stove, the occasional creak of tree limbs, the soft periodic drip from the cave beyond. Sometime after she drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, she woke to the sound of voices. At first, she thought it was a dream. Then she recognized her own voice, muffled, coming from just outside the tent. Kind of perfect, right? It even has a creepy natural amphitheater vibe. That was what she had said hours ago when they first arrived. The cadence, the slight rise on right, it was exact. She held her breath. Josh's voice followed, laughing, replying with a comment about the layout, also word for word identical to their earlier conversation. The voices did not sound like they were in the present. They sounded like a recording played back in open air, slightly tinny. The edges of consonants softened. They moved slowly around the camp, circling, the direction of the sound shifting as if carried by an unseen speaker on a lazy, deliberate path. Abigail unzipped her tent a fraction of an inch and peered out. The clearing glowed faintly under cloud-filtered starlight. The last coals in the fire pit glimmered dull red. Josh's tent sat exactly where it should, zipped shut, no light inside. No figures moved between the trees. No equipment stood playing audio on its own. But the voices kept circling, bleeding in and out, overlapping with newer fragments. If you're seeing this, we never got to upload. Abby, come on, this is... We nailed the layout. Do not go in the cave. That last one she had not heard herself say yet. The tone was ragged, like someone out of breath, and it came from directly behind her tent, too close. She fumbled for her headlamp and camera, hands clumsy with adrenaline. When she thumbed the lamp on, the beam cut across nylon and then through the gap in the zipper to the clearing beyond. The voices stopped mid-syllable, cut off as cleanly as microphone power being killed. "Josh," she called softly. No answer. She unzipped the tent the rest of the way and stepped out, lamps sweeping the clearing. Josh's tent was empty, the flap open, sleeping bag rumpled as if he had gotten up in a hurry. His boots were gone, so was his jacket. The cave mouth yawned at the edge of her vision, swallowing her light when she turned toward it. From inside, faint and hollow, she heard her own voice again, this time live, ragged with panic. "Josh, do not go in the cave." She did not say the words. Her mouth was closed. The voice echoed from the dark, repeated once, twice. The second iteration slightly delayed. The third stretched out in a way that made her skin crawl. There was another voice underneath it, Josh's, shouting something she could not make out, and then the sound of feet on rock, a scuffle, a choked exhalation cut short. Abigail took 3 steps toward the cave before something in her tightened like a hand on the back of her collar. Every missing person case she had ever researched, every thin paragraph about last seen entering the woods, flared in her mind. She stopped. Her own warning, whether from the future or a version of her that had already followed, hung in the air. She backed away instead, grabbed her keys, her pack with the hard drives, left the tents and cooking gear where they were. She did not call Josh again. She could not bear to hear whatever answered. By the time she reached the SUV, dawn was a gray smear on the horizon. Her hands shook so badly she dropped the keys twice before she got the engine turned over. She did not look in the rearview mirror as she drove down the rutted road. She did not want to risk seeing their camp from a different angle, framed exactly like a grainy photo in an archive she had not read yet. The Rangers found the campsite 2 days later, neat and undisturbed except for one missing tent and a single set of boot prints leading to the cave and not back out. Abigail answered every question, showed them the footage, played them the audio. On the recordings, the circling voices were barely there, a faint ghost under the hiss of night, easy to dismiss as interference. Her initial warning from the cave played back clear, though, as did Josh's last shout. The official report called it a disappearance, unresolved. She never published the Hollow Ridge episode. The files sit on a drive in a box in her closet, labeled and dated, just like all her other projects. Some nights, when the apartment is very quiet, she hears muffled versions of herself talking in the next room. Lines she knows she recorded on other shoots, lines she has not yet said. She refuses to play back the Hollow Ridge footage again, not because she is afraid of what she will hear, but because she is afraid she will hear nothing at all. No proof that the mountains spoke in their voices. No evidence that Josh ever made a sound after he stepped into the dark. Urban legends, she has decided, are not rough drafts of history. They are warnings from people who did not get out in time, looped and repeated until someone listens. Hollow Ridge has a new verse now about 2 more campers who matched a story too closely. She hopes nobody ever recognizes themselves in it the way she did, sitting by a fire with newsprint smudging her fingers, realizing that the camp in the photograph was not a remnant from the past but a preview.